And board members, thank you for attending today, our board budget workshop on February 27th, 2023. if we can have the presentation, please. Now start talking through the purpose and intent of today's workshop. So we craft this workshop to engage with the board, a fundamental understanding and knowledge of our budget development process, our revenues, our expenditures, and our capital program and capital investment and financing. So today we'll be covering those areas specifically. You all should be able to see the presentation on your screens, but let us know if you need more time to pull them up. Thank you. Okay, again, next slide, please. So the first thing to note is that we have some additional engagement coming up with the board. So in April, in addition to this financial overview that we'll cover today, we'll have an FY24 budget update. This is where we come to the board, let you know the status of the FY24 budget development process, major assumptions, key discussions around the budget development at the time, and we just engage with the board for discussion and feedback. In May, we come before the board to present the first reading of the budget. This is basically the preliminary budget that we push forward with revenue assumptions. If the state budget is pretty solid at that point, we come forward with our revenue assumptions, as well as any expenditure assumptions that we have and outstanding organizational decisions that we've made at that point. By June, we come to the board with the second reading of the budget. That's the budget finalization. That's where you'll vote and adopt the budget. But we go through the final revenues, final projected revenues, the anticipated expenditures for the fiscal year, and any key assumptions in the budget. And we just engage in a Q&A in advance of your vote. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So again, today, the process that we've outlined is to talk through the budget development process to give you guys a 40,000 foot view of what our budget development process looks like, where our revenue sources are, where they come from, expenditures, what are our primary expense drivers, and fund balance. We'll talk about how we build our fund balance and have built our fund balance over the last several years. And then finally, we'll close out with the audited financials. This will cover the budget workshop related to the general operating fund. Subsequent to this presentation, we'll have our bond counsel and PFM, our financial advisors, cover the capital portion for you to provide a foundational knowledge of that as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, budget development process. So the big picture, what happens when we develop school budgets? So the budget development process for us really starts with the enrollment projections. The enrollment projections are where we project out the anticipated enrollment as a district, as well as at each particular school. This has funding implications for the schools, and also it gives us really good insight into what's happening in our schools, whether more students are coming in or more students are leaving the system, where they're coming at, et cetera. So that process is actually managed by our Director of Real Estate, Ms. Angela Barnett. She actually works under Mr. Barori in his shop. And so she starts with the enrollment projections for the upcoming fiscal year. She uses a number of assumptions, just to name a few. She looks at prior year actuals. She looks at developments coming online. She looks at a lot of the economic data that's needed as well to be able to predict out where our schools, where our enrollment will be for our schools. Next is the CRF development. CRF is a contract recommendation form. So what this is, it's a form that we've designed. All schools have access to this form, and it's a complete roster of all of the employees in their school. And the intent behind it is to see what positions are filled, what positions are vacant, and also to establish intention on if teachers are going to stay at that school or if they've made some type of notice that they want to leave. It's a living document of the staffing that's at that particular school. This information then goes to HR, and they have an entire process on that they go through. And Mr. Brigman is here to speak through that if you all have questions, in order to decide what the teacher contract issuance will be. The staff allocations process, just to go through, So we look at the projected enrollment at each school, and we use a ratio to determine the number of teachers that are provided at each particular school. So it's a staffing model, and we'll go through an example of that for you today, just to give you better insight. So once the teacher contracts are issued, we then take all of the data, we being finance, we take all of the data and we do what's called a budget reconciliation. This is an enormous process. We take all the information from the schools, we take all the information from the central office, we look at the budget, we look at expenditures, and we go through cleaning the data, scrubbing the data to really make sure we balance budget to expenditures. Legally, you have to have a balanced budget. And so we go through that process, and that's how we establish the budget that's presented forward to you. Now, there are a lot of in-between steps in each one of these processes. This is just a very big picture, high level. Once we have the budget reconciled, we go to first reading, as I discussed earlier. Then second, the board then approves the budget. And then what happens once the budget is approved, July 1, the budget is active and live. We begin to transact financially. We record those financial transactions, and we do monthly financial reporting. So those are the reports that I've been coming to the committee and the board with to say, here's a snapshot of our revenues, our expenditures. This is how we're anticipating to end the current fiscal year. It's us keeping a pulse on the budget that we developed with the actual activity that's happening financially. Once the fiscal year closes, we have an external audit firm come in to do financial statements. So the district is obligated to have an external financial audit. And we have our external auditors, Green Finney is the current audit firm that we use, and they audit our budget through their process. We give them a trial balance, and they begin to work through their scenarios and their testing. Okay. I'd like to introduce Ms. Lisa Sizzler. She's the Assistant Executive Director for Finance to discuss enrollment summary. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon. As Ms. Williams noted on the previous slide, projected enrollment is a starting point for developing our school budgets, and we track it year over year for enrollment trends. This chart summarizes the total projected and 7-day enrollments for FY22 and 23 and the projected enrollment for FY24. And as she said, enrollment by school and grade level is projected for the next fiscal year by the operational planning department in the spring, and it's used for budget planning. Actual school enrollment is counted on several days during the first 2 weeks of the school year. And as a result of that actual enrollment count on the 7th day of school, staffing allocations to schools are adjusted and finalized. The 7-day process will be described in a bit more detail on an upcoming slide. Next slide, please. Positions are allocated to schools based on the projected enrollment and established class, school size, and grade span formulas. The tables on this slide provide several examples of the allocations to teachers. In the first example, we have a school with projected enrollment of 159 students in second grade, and going across the table with a class size divisor of 25 students per class. We get 6.36 if you do the math, but for elementary schools, we round that up to 7 FTEs for that classroom. So based on those students in that divisor, we would have 7 teachers in that school for second grade. The number all the way over to the right-hand column is a per pupil school, what we call a per pupil school supply allocation. Schools are allocated $75 per student, and that is to cover supplies, media center items, printing and copying, and other school expenses. So in our second grade example, we had 159 students. At $75 per student, that school would receive $11,925 for those non-salary expense allocations. And then at the school's discretion, they divide that money up and decide how to spend that on their school.
Could you repeat that again about the $75?
So for each student in the school's allocated $75. So if a school has 100 students, they would get $7,500. The money is meant to be allocated for supplies, media center items, printing and copying, and any other school level expenses that the school chooses to spend. $75 per student.
$75 or 7,500?
$75, the example I just gave was 100 students would be 7,500. So it's $75 per student.
And that's actually what we allocate per student is $75?
Just for that non-salary supply portion.
I'd like to know the total at some point.
So working down the examples, there's an example of a fifth grade. The math on all of them works exactly the same. The divisors are different depending on what grade level and grade span. And in middle schools and high schools, we round up if the calculation comes out to over 0.5, and we round down if it's under a 0.5. Next slide, Maggie.
Thank you. So, thank you, Ms. Isler. So toggling back to further detailing the 7-day adjustment review process. So we start off with the budget based off of projected enrollment. On the 7th day of school, we take actual enrollment, that's attendance, students and seats. Once we have the actual enrollment, we then compare it to the projected enrollment, and we look at if there are variances. So if there are more students or less students than we projected or anticipated. If there are variances, we then work through a process to adjust that school's staffing allocation. So for example, if school A, we thought was going to have 100 students and they have 20 teachers, let's say, and school A actually had 50 students, they don't need 20 teachers, but school B may have received another 100 students. So we reallocate the staffing resources based on the actual enrollment. So it's a true up of our projected enrollment and our actual enrollment. And that's how we reallocate the staffing resources to schools to make sure our schools have adequate staff in place for the number of students they actually have. And throughout this process, this isn't just a financial process. Human resources and learning services are at the table with the level leaders at the school. So the schools have representation in this meeting as well as financial, human resource, and academic representation. And so we talk about the condition, the climate of the schools, what's happening, and schools are able to petition through this process if they need additional resources. And so we work through this 7-day adjustment process as a collective with the school representation at the table as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn over the revenue component to Ms. Jackie Carlin. Jackie is also going to be our interim CFO.
Thank you. So for general operating fund, there are 4 sources of revenue. Excuse me. There's local sources, state sources, federal, and what we call transfers. The transfers basically are reimbursements from special revenue funds, whether it's part of the EIA allocation to cover salaries and benefits, or it could be overhead costs from other special revenue funds to reimburse general fund. The local sources are about 62% of our overall revenues, whereas state sources are about 35% and transfers are 3.6%. So our budgeted FY23 revenues are at $640.8 million. On the most recent financial update, which was the December financial update that was presented to Audit and Finance and Committee of the Whole in February, we were showing that we were going to exceed the revenue budget by $5.1 million. Next slide. So majority of the district's local revenues come from property taxes, also known as local tax revenues. Taxes are levied on personal property as well as non-owner occupied real property based on a set millage rate that is approved by the board. There's a millage limitation on the actual increase, which is based on the local population growth plus the consumer price index increase. And unfortunately, those numbers, we have to wait on those numbers to come to us from the South Carolina Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Office. So using the FY23 projected local tax revenue, the value of a mill is approximately $3 million. So the chart below represents the 12-year overview of our operations millage. And as of right now for FY23, our current operations millage is at 130 mills. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a breakdown for calculating the projected local tax revenues. We typically receive updated assessments from the Charleston County Auditor's Office in the spring as well as the fall. And so as soon as we receive the spring updated assessments, we can start working on projected local tax revenues. So the first three line items where it's got projected non-owner occupied real property assessments, and that also includes fee in lieu fee in lieu of taxes. And then the next line, the projected personal property assessments, and then the projected motor vehicle assessments, all of those numbers come from the county auditor's office. And so we come up with we add all those numbers together to come up with a projected property base. And from there, we can multiply our millage rate, which in this example is 0.130, to come to an estimated total property tax. This is what we are projecting to receive whenever you combine the motor vehicle taxes. So you'll notice that we have motor vehicle assessments January through June, and then another line item that has motor vehicle taxes prior year, July through December. And that's because if there is a millage increase change or a millage change, the January through June represents the new millage rate, whereas the July through December the prior year, July through December for motor vehicles represents the old or the prior year millage rate. And so whenever you add in the prior year, July through December for motor vehicles, then we get a projected tax revenue before credits. And this is the number that we consistently tie back to the Charleston County Auditor's Office with, so that we know we have a good baseline. Now, the next line item is, we don't have any control over this, but these are the tax increment financings as well as economic rebates. And you'll notice that $23.7 million number is deducted from our revenues. And like I said, we don't have any control over that at this point. So then, yes, sir. Mhm.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Oh.
Whoever was. Who was it?
Oh, I was just gonna say, on these TIFs, how long are these TIFs in place? I mean, how many of them are there and how long are they in place?
So we have 6 active TIFs right now. They're called tax incremental financings. We have 3 with the city of Charleston, and we have 3 with the city of North Charleston. We have 2 that have been approved that are not active. The last time I checked with the auditor's office. And so, I have information I don't have with me right now, but I track them with end dates. And if memory serves me right, the most recent one that's an active TIF won't end until 2038.
So typically TIFs follow the life cycle of the bond. So bond issuance can be from 30 to 40 years. So they're long-term financial obligations.
What are the TIF districts, if you don't mind my asking?
So can we come back and provide that information? We just don't have that level of detail with us today. Great question.
I would add, when Ms. Carlin said that we don't have any control, that's a true statement. We don't have control over existing TIFs. So those are already locked in for whatever period of time. But the board does have control over any proposed new TIFs. It was 2 or 3 years ago, we actually developed a TIF policy, and that policy simply says that we, I mean, it's a lengthy document, but essentially says that we, the district, is in the business of educating students as opposed to supporting the economic development of the community, of the county. And so there has to be some really compelling reasons that would support the district in order for the board to agree to go into a TIF. And so, but that's a policy that was put in place maybe 3 years ago.
I think exploring the TIF districts would be a good option for revenue. If it's possible, is that what you're saying, that it might be difficult for us to do that?
No, what I'm saying is that for any future proposed TIFs, you all have absolute control over that, whether you want to go through a TIF or participate or not. And it's been the history since we put that policy in place that we have not participated. But for the TIFs that the finance team is going to provide to you all, that currently exist, we have no choice but what to forego that $23.7 million per year until the TIFs are expire.
And they typically take money out of the district, which is one of the compelling reasons why the board adopted the policy, to be able to have a say in whether we endeavor on future TIFs.
So I'm gonna give you an example. So with the Mount Pleasant Town Center the district entered into a TIF agreement with Mount Pleasant. I don't know, Carol, you might know, but years ago. And that TIF just expired, I think probably 4 years ago. And at that point, we were losing $10 million of potential revenue through the loss of that TIF. But it expired, so it's no longer in this $23.7 million.
Ms. Williams, just trying to clarify, you said the last tip will expire in 2038?
So that's the ones that Ms. Carlin just mentioned, but what I noted was that TIFs usually last the life cycle of the bond, which typically is 30+ years.
Right, because I thought if we pay off a bond early, because I know under the guidance that we're trying to attempt to pay them off by 2032.
But that's
So
separate.
go ahead, Jackie.
What you're referring to is our overall long-term debt for the district. We're talking right now here, we're just talking about the general fund reductions to our revenue.
Right.
And
Yes,
so
sir.
the bonds that we're referring to that would expire, they're not the district's bonds.
Correct.
They're the bonds that the whatever governmental entity we entered into a TIF agreement with. They issue the bonds. And so we are committed to forego that revenue until those bonds are paid off.
Correct.
And if you remember, I noted that we had 2 inactive bonds that were approved by this board, but that nothing has been happening with them based upon the conversations I've had recently with the Charleston County Auditor's Office. And so, I'm sorry, to finish out this slide, we come up with our projected local tax revenue after the reductions, which is $382.8 million. And how we calculate the value of a mill is we divide that number by 130 mills. And so that there you'll see that the approximate value of a mill is about $3 million. And I tell you that so that when you're having budget discussions and you're wondering, how much would it cost for us to, just hypothetically, how much would it cost for us to increase millage, the millage rate by 3? It would be $9 million. Next slide, please. So this slide covers the different categories for all the local revenues. For the first four line items actually tie back to our local tax revenues, the ad valorem, the delinquent taxes. The other taxes is also our heavy equipment taxes, and then our fee in lieu. Now, I do want to point out the information we just covered on the prior slide does not include what we budget and what we receive for delinquent taxes or for other taxes. So if you add the ad valorem tax line item and the fee in lieu tax line item, it'll tie back to what we were just discussing before we calculated a mill value. And so we also have regular day school from patrons, which is our out-of-county tuition. When we have another student attending our district from an outside county, we have the capability to bill the parents for that cost, and that's where we would record those revenues. The next line, we have interest on investments. We earn interest on several of our bank accounts throughout the district. And the next line is rentals and leases. And this is where we would record, whenever we rent our facilities out, this is where we would record that revenue coming in. And then there's receipt of insurance proceeds and refund of prior year's expenditures and miscellaneous. So the local revenue piece by itself for our budget was $393.6 million. And as I said earlier, when we actually reported whenever we reported the most recent financial update for December, we reported that we were going to come in over budget by $4.9 million just on local revenues. Next slide, please. So shifting to state revenues, FY23 was the first year of the new state aid funding. In prior years, our per pupil funding was based on a cost per student cost. A base student cost. And now the new funding is completely different. There are more variables involved. The biggest thing is the funding is based on the targeted student teacher ratio and a cost per teacher defined at the state level. The student teacher ratio does not just include classroom teachers. It includes special ed teachers, pre-K, kindergarten, library media specialists, guidance counselors, et cetera. And also I'd like to note that the student teacher ratio is not defined by class size. This is not the same as a traditional pupil to teacher ratio. And then the last piece, this is real important. The state defined the cost of a teacher. The state defined cost of a teacher is not the same cost that we actually pay for our teachers. We pay higher than the state minimum salary schedule. And I just wanted to point that out. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Ms. Carlin. So just to recap for state revenues, so the state aid to classroom program allocation was implemented in FY '23 through the legislative session. That's our new funding formula. It replaced the EFA, Education Finance Act funding that operated off of a base base student costs. There was anticipated to be property tax relief through the Act 388, and that was from to replace owner occupied taxes under Act 388. However, and restricted state revenue for specific special programs, funding towards teacher salary and benefit increases and retiree health. So what that means is we do receive revenues from the state to supplement a portion of our teacher salaries. However, because our teachers make more than the state scales, it's never a fully funded initiative from the state. So we don't receive enough funding from the state to cover our teacher salaries.
What is the amount that the state gives us per teacher?
So I would have to break that out, Dr. Temple, and we'll note that and follow up. Also, other state revenue includes a portion of the state increased a portion of the retiree pension. So this has been a cost that's been gradually shifting over to districts. The pension shift from the state to the local districts, they fund a portion of that. General operating fund funds the rest of it. So it's not even a fully funded obligation that's being pushed over to the school district. Thank you. Next slide, please. So under Act 388, which began in 2008, school districts no longer receive property taxes for operations from its owner occupied homes. However, Act 388 uses the index of tax paying ability as an indication of the property values within school districts. The paradox is that Act 388 limits or caps the amount of revenue that we can raise based off of the property value by eliminating school districts operating levies on owner occupied property, but it doesn't fully replace it, meaning Act 388 says, okay, we'll put this in place. You can't tax your owner occupied properties. Here's an alternate revenue source, but it doesn't fully fund our needs. There's a paradox where it limits our ability to levy and to generate revenues that would or should replace the owner occupied tax income that we would get. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're going to move on to talk to revenues a little bit now. Health expenditures, sorry. This graph illustrates the breakdown of our FY '23 budgeted general fund expenditures. The majority of our funding goes to support our schools, and the majority of that support is in the form of salaries and benefits. So working around from the top of the graph to the right, the blue salaries, orange employee benefits, green purchase services, and yellow materials and supplies wedges total 77% of the general fund budget, and that represents allocations of staffing, services, and non-salary amounts to schools. 11% is payments to school-sponsored charter and partner schools, and another 11% is district offices. The final 1% remaining relates to capital outlay and reserves, each of which account for less than 1% of the total. Next slide, please. For FY '23, we made several investments in teacher and staff retention. The first table on this slide summarizes those investments and the cost of each. For teachers, we provided a step increase to eligible teachers, and a step is the movement of one increment up the salary schedule for a year of experience. In fiscal '22 and for many years prior to that, the top step on our salary schedules was 26 years. In FY '23, we were able to increase the maximum step from 26 years to 30 years, which allowed us to provide additional compensation to our most experienced teachers in recognition of their valuable experience to us. In addition, all teachers received a $2,000 salary increase. On the next line down, non-teachers also received a step increase and the extension of that step cap to 30 years as well. And the salary schedules were adjusted for non-teachers to maintain the 97% of market that was attained in the budget for FY22. In addition, we raised the minimum hourly wage for all permanent positions to $17 an hour. The total cost of these investments was $15.7 million for teachers and $10.7 million for non-teachers. And there are also annual changes in the employee benefit rates, which impact the budget each year. That's the table at the bottom of the slide. In FY23, the state required an increase to the employer share of retirement of 1%, which is equivalent to approximately $3 million in cost. And we projected an increase of $1.7 million to the cost of employer health insurance. Next slide, please. The table on this slide details the required employer contribution to the state retirement system since fiscal year 2015. In FY 2017, the state announced that it would begin raising the base employer retirement rate over the next 6 years. It was raised 2% in FY 18 and was to be raised 1% for the next 5 fiscal years, FY 19 through FY 23. However, due to the uncertainty surrounding COVID, the increase was suspended for FY 21, which now puts the last year of this planned increase out to FY 24. So just as an example of what the employer rate means to the district, at the FY 23 rate for an employee salary of $50,000 a year, the district is required to contribute $11,905 to the state retirement system. And the last thing I wanted to point out on this slide is the note at the bottom. If the total employer contribution rate had remained 15.9%, which was the rate in 2015, our FY 23 projected budget for retirement would have been $51 million. But because this rate has continued to increase, it's now at 23.81%. Our actual projected budget for retirement from FY 23 was $75 million. So I just wanted to emphasize how large of a portion how that affects us and what a large portion of our budget that is.
And that's not funded by the state.
So did they not put a cap?
Well, there's.
It just is going to keep going?
Well, theoretically, they're supposed to stop in FY 24 from this round of increases that were announced in 2017. What they do after that point, we don't really know.
We haven't been informed yet. It's over time. It was the state's intent to distribute more of the cost over to the district from the state. So we've been absorbing more and more on general fund.
And that's why they have a surplus and we don't. I'm just saying.
Thank you, Lisa. In addition, so if you recall the pie chart that you saw that about 63% of our total general fund budget goes to salary and benefits and retirement for our employees. In addition to that, we have what we call contractual must-dos. So when you start to think about student transportation and energy and water, those are must-dos. We have to keep the lights on in the buildings. We have to keep the heat going, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we look at our contractual must-dos, these are just a few that we've pulled out. Next slide, please. These are just a few that we pulled out just to show you. So we have our obligations with our charter schools and meeting streets. In FY 23, that increased by $5.6 million. Property and flood insurance, a little under $500,000. Our custodial grounds maintenance and other contracts related to operations, about approximately $5 million. And these are just the increases. Our energy and water increase of a little under $1 million, and our student transportation a little over $500,000. So this is $12.5 million of just the increase. The total contracts are significantly higher than $12.5 million. So for example, our utilities, Lisa, is about what, 20 million? Our utilities currently is about 20 million a year just to keep the lights on. And so there's salary, benefits, retirement, and then there are all of these other contractual must-dos that we also have to budget for annually. And just like any other contract, there's inflation, there are terms and agreements. We have to rebid things out at the end of a contract term, et cetera. And we're subject to market rates at that particular point. So, next slide, please.
I want to ask one question,
Yes,
make sure
ma'am.
that I'm looking at this correctly. On custodial grounds, maintenance and other contracts, am I reading this correctly that we've gone from fiscal year 22, 1.6 million to fiscal year 23, 4.9 million, almost 5 million?
Yes.
Whoa, do you have a
Number of
breakdown as to
things.
why it jumped up so high?
It was a new bid contract, and it's gonna go up another 4 million next year.
Yes.
We put the contract out for bid, and the employees were paid extremely low.
Volunteers.
They paid the new rates, that was an increase in 1 year.
What's the
Correct.
contract for?
It's for all the custodial in the
In the entire district.
Oh, so that other contract with the other custodians that weren't actually taking care of the buildings, this one better, right?
Pay people to actually do the work.
So
You have to pay people to do the work and they weren't paying folks.
one thing that we also saw to piggyback off of Mr. Barori's point, there was a significant increase in inflation in the market. The operations cost on many specific areas have increased. And we'll talk a little bit about that later when we get to the debt portion of the presentation. Thank you. So the district's financial position. So I want to talk about fund balance, just so everyone understands what it is and how we've achieved the fund balance status that we have. So the district's fund balance is a major indicator in the district's financial position. It's a requirement for our rating, for debt, et cetera. It also really speaks to the financial health and condition of the overall district. So the fund balance is a total accumulation of operating surplus, essentially revenues less expenses. So deficits are not good, surpluses are good. And so we have a fund balance policy here in the district that we use to manage. Our external auditors have vetted our policy as well. And what we try to do, what we do actually, is make sure that we're in compliant with that policy, and we make sure that we are building and or adding to fund balance by being good financial stewards over our resources. So positive fund balance indicates that we have a net surplus and have exceeded net deficits, which is great. Next slide, please. So this slide is important. What this is, the red and the blue lines represent the district's revenue and expenditure. So you see that as our expenditures have increased, so have our revenues. And even though those two are very almost similarly parallel and almost extremely aligned, we still were able to create a healthy fund balance for the district, specifically based around good financial practice and intentionality. And so we'll talk about some of how we got there shortly. Next slide, please. All right. This is one of my favorite slides. So if you look at 2014, you look at 2015, and then you look at 2016, the district was in significant financial disarray at that particular point, so much so where it triggered the attention of state representatives, legislators, et cetera. The district was, at the time, fiscal watch. And so what we had to do, and so let me tell you the danger in this. So our payroll is about what? Its payroll is essentially $40 million, every payroll, right? $12.2 million meant that if the district ever had any financial issue or challenge, we would not even be able to make payroll. So this is significantly bad. From FY17 to FY22, good financial leadership, the district began to put practices in place and really focus on maintaining and achieving fund balance, a positive surplus fund balance. It was through a number of different efforts. One was being more intentional about the budget, actually looking at positions, the district's affordability, studying our revenues closer, managing our expenses tighter, remediating audit findings, and establishing the fund balance policy. And year over year, this is something that we pay explicit close attention to. The Audit and Finance Committee paid very close attention to this during the time of rebuilding. And now we're happy to report that as of FY22, we have $158.9 million in fund balance. If you guys recall, during COVID happened in FY22, we were able to maintain flat fund balance. That's great. There was a lot of uncertainty in economic recession during the onset of COVID, and the district maintained its financial stability. I think that's noteworthy. Next slide, please. Okay, so fund balance is just not a big pot of money that we can use however we see fit. So there are rules, GASB, generally accepted. Oh, that's GASB, generally accepted. Governmental, yes. So Governmental Standards Board, GASB, excuse me, mixing up my acronyms. They've established and defined how we can allocate resources and fund balance. So there's a non-spendable portion of fund balance, which are assets that can't be spent. So this is prepaid items, inventory, et cetera. We cannot spend that money. Currently, we have 7.2 million in fund balance there. Restricted are amounts as reserved due to legislation, regulation, et cetera. Restricted is also meaning we cannot spend that reserve in that particular portion of the fund. Then there's committed. So these are amounts that are specifically designated, and it requires a formal action of the board. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, I brought forward the ESSER sustainability for a $10 million allocation to go into fund balance. So that 10 million would be a part of that 72.8 million that you see there. But it's required by an actual official board action to commit a portion of fund balance. Assigned, this is the planned use of fund balance for budgeting. So you'll learn about this in our budgeting process. So revenues come in, although we've been faring pretty well with revenues, our expenses are growing at a rate faster than our revenues. And so we have a budget gap. And so we use fund balance and we assign a portion of fund balance to close that budget gap. And so that's the plan that we anticipate to use to close the budget gap during the budget development process. Again, legally, we have to provide a balanced budget. Revenues have to tie to expenditures. And so that's why assigned is critical for us. And then there is unassigned fund balance. And these are amounts that are not contained in any of the other categories. There's a little more discretion in this particular area, but unassigned does not mean not designated. We're not just, unassigned means that it's just not committed, restricted, or non-spendable. Reasons to maintain a healthy fund balance: provides cash flow and support for cyclical tax collections, flexibility for discretionary needs, helps us with our rating, and covers potential emergencies and unanticipated expenditures. Mr. Kennedy.
Sean, if I may. So on that committed, the $72.8 million is that really is the district's safety net. So it was put in there, and that's a certain, there are formulas that say how much that should be. And so that number changes each year based on that formula that's associated with what Ms. Williams says is the GASB federal requirements, as well as the state of South Carolina requirements. And so that is the district's emergency fund. If some real disaster were to occur, then you all, the board, then would have a pool of dollars to act upon for that emergency.
Thank you, sir. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So the next three slides actually came from a board presentation on November 14th by Green Finney Colley, which is our external audit firm. And what she was doing was presenting the preliminary FY22 financial audit. The final audit had no changes, so that's why I went ahead and just pulled this from it. So our audited revenues for FY22 were $588.5 million. Majority of that was from property taxes as well as state revenues. From FY21 to 22, we saw a $32.5 million increase in revenues, And that was mostly attributable to property tax increases.
On the audit, what exactly is the purpose of this audit? Is it just to show that everything is balancing out? That something's gone missing, or is it actually looking for anything in particular?
So it's a full financial audit. And when I say full, it means that it's a sample, but it's a full financial audit. So it's not an audit. It's not like a policy and procedure audit. It's looking at our revenues, our expenditures, our accounting, our books, our trial balances, making sure we're recording things and classifying things properly according to GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, as well as making sure that we're GASB compliant, like the fund balance policy. So they take a deep dive into the financial condition of the organization. And it's required legally.
We were doing this even in fiscal year 16. That's what got us under the
So, Mr. Kennedy, I'll defer to you on the historical context for that period of time.
We were doing this in fiscal year 16, doing the outside audit each year, correct? And that's how we got under the financial watch in 16.
So there were a number of things that were taking place then. First of all, I wasn't here in 16.
Right.
So I'm not able to really articulate what occurred. What I can say that when I did come on board, I took a look at all the procedures that we had in place, specifically around how we pay attention to monitoring and reporting to the Audit and Finance Committee each month, the status of revenues and expenditures. And then at this time each year, start projecting out where we think we're going to end the year when the books close. And so based on that strategy, we're able to manage the flow of revenue and expenditures against expenditures at the last 6 months of the year. And that resulted in the increase in the fund balance that you see. But there were things that were going on in 2015, I think, that resulted in the decrease in our financial condition. I don't know. Well, I'm not attributing this to any
One person.
any one person. It's just financial management. And I don't know if Lisa, I know you were here during that time period.
I was, and Dr. Postlewaite came on during the summer of 2015, or 2016. She was after that. She was here when the fallout happened, but she wasn't here when leading up to it. The majority of it was, like John said, we had some issues with financial reporting and some mistakes that were made on some of the reporting documents that were presented. And there was also budgets that weren't adhered to at the time that caused us to go over budget. So it was a result of over budgeting revenue and under budgeting expenditures caused us to overspend. So we had a forensic audit after that point. There was no wrongdoing uncovered for anything. It was just a matter of our financial practices at the time were not adequate.
Right. Now, I only ask because I never want to get back to that place, but.
Me neither.
Word. But and I'm going back a couple slides to 24, and it's looking like we are. I guess y'all about to get into this also, that our revenue is going to be less than the expenditures for 23.
So we're say that. Can you ask that again, Mr. Calhoun?
Right. I'm looking at the line graph that we have for the
Maggie, can you go back to that slide, please?
right, for fiscal year 23, it's looking like 653.1, and then for expenditures, and then for the revenue, 645.8.
I think it's the other line graph, Maggie. Slide 24, yes. Nope, thank you.
Yep, that one.
Thank you. So where we're projecting to end 23 is that revenues are coming in higher than we budgeted. And expenses are coming in right around where we budgeted, but we're actually anticipating to use less fund balance. So that means that we're actually coming in better than we anticipated for 23.
We like that.
too.
So those numbers would not be reflected on this slide.
No.
Those numbers would be reflected on the monthly financial report that will be presented during the board meeting this afternoon. These are budgeted numbers, not actuals.
Correct.
Yes.
All right.
Maggie, 28.
28, please. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. So to finish up, we actually exceeded the budget on revenues for FY22 by about $11.9 million. And this was due to property tax increases as well as state increases. Next slide, please. So audited expenditures. Those came in at $591.5 million. Most of that was tied to classroom instruction as well as support services. And Lisa had talked earlier about the increases in salary and benefits, so that was a large piece of it as well. We saw a $20.4 million increase from FY21 to 22, and that was mostly attributed to salaries and benefits, as well as our ongoing operational expenses.
And
Slide,
what are community services? I
Those,
understand the other items.
that's okay. Let me look up the terminology so that I can make
Thank
sure I
you.
do this right.
Can we follow up with that with you, Ms. McKinney? Because we actually have to pull up the audit and look at the detail
follow up.
behind it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Keep going then. I can wait.
Thank you. We'll get that to you. Slide 30, please. Sorry, one back, Maggie. Okay, so this was the portion of the presentation that was pulled out from the FY22 financial audit, and it just reiterates the strength in our fund balance and our financial position. So overall, as a result of financial activity from FY22, we increased the fund balance by 13.7 million. That took it to the 159 million that you saw. Our non-spendable fund balance, 7.2 million. Again, that was for inventory and prepaids. Committed fund balance, 72.8 million for operating reserves. And assigned fund balance, this is the board action particular category, 41.6 million for FY23 budget and ESSER stabilization and sustainability. Next slide, please. So this concludes the review, the high-level overview of the general fund. Yes,
What do
ma'am.
you mean by ESSER stabilization and
Mhm.
sustainability? How do you define that?
Absolutely. So when it comes to ESSER, and this is a national conversation across all school districts, it's called the ESSER funding cliff. And what that is the districts have received a significant portion of money. They've attached people, programs to this money. And so everyone is concerned and talking about the district and various districts on, well, what do we do when the money sunsets, when it goes away? And so what we took to the board last year was to be proactive for programs and projects that we deem as necessary to continue in the district. So we don't just cut services off that are critical and funded by ESSER, is to designate a portion of fund balance for sustainability and stabilization. So it's to hedge that funding cliff once we decide whatever the sustainable activities are, programs that are tethered to ESSER. Any additional questions? Thank you, Dr. Temple. So just reiterating again that we have 3 more engagement sessions with the board. In April, we'll have an additional follow-up with the board for a budget update. In May, we'll take the first reading or the preliminary budget, bring that forward to the board with our projected revenues, expenditures, and all of our initiatives. And then by June, you will have the final budget in front of you for voting and adoption. Yes, sir, Mr. Calhoun.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to think of how to ask this with the ESSER stabilization and sustainability. We're doing that with all piloted projects, correct? All piloted projects going on through the district. So say if we got grant funding, like the federal grant funding for D9, that's going on right now. We're finding out how we can, with the sustainability of us taking on after the grant sunsets, over like 5 years or so, how we be able to expand that throughout the district itself?
So it's not for all grants. So it depends on the grant. So there are
Right.
some grants that are single year grants and there's grants and there's some that are multi-year. And it depends on the purpose and the timeline of the grant. So I'd have to know specifically which grant you're talking
Right.
about to.
I'm just thinking about for any grant that we get, if we bring it in, if we see something that's working with that grant, with any grant that we bring in, how do we expand it throughout the district, but then also try to make it sustainable that we will always know we can pay for it?
Great question. So for most grants, you have the option to reapply and get awarded again. ESSER, because it was tied to the American Rescue Plan, it's stimulus funds, it's looked at as a one-time fund source.
Right.
But if you take a look at things like Head Start or early childhood, we submit an application every year requesting that money. So that money's been in the district for several years. That holds true for other grants as well. Title II, for instance, a lot of professional development for teachers is funded by Title II, and that's a recurring grant that the district receives. So it just depends on the grant and the stipulations attached to it.
Like I'm thinking about another one I'm specifically thinking about would be with the acceleration schools and the bonuses that we put out that are can come in with the teachers if they raise the test scores or whatnot. How can we look at over 5 to 10 years, think how we can bring that under the district as opposed to an outside agency? You know,
That's a great question. So those are some of the actual conversations and questions that the administration and the board engages in when we're talking about building the budget.
right,
I don't have an answer for that today, for that specific example.
right.
But typically, the district looks at critical work and the continuity of that critical work. So in previous years, there were things that were tethered, that were those items in future years. So those conversations happen. So yes, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking further a
Yes,
little bit. But no, thank you.
thank you. So now we'll have the portion of our presentation that's related to our debt and debt service. We have Jay from PFM and Carol Clark, our bond counsel. So Maggie, if you could bring up that presentation. And the purpose of this presentation is to give you guys a very high level overview of our debt, how it's structured, how we pay our payments, et cetera, what that universe looks like. Thank you.
Sorry, Jay, this was the presentation we were supposed to have at the cow the other day. Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'll give this a try between the two of us in case we need to share. So I'm Carol Clark with Haynes Receivler Boyd Law Firm here in Charleston, and I've been working with the district for close to 20 years now. And this is Jay Glover with Public Financial Management out of Orlando, and they've been financial advisor to the district for about the same length of time. And while Ms. Williams and her team were really focusing on operations and on the operating fund, we're really looking more at the debt side of things, the debt financing for long-term capital projects, and also the debt millage side of the equation. There are several different types of financings we go through every year. And great, we got the slides on now. And one of these is actually on the agenda for today's meeting, which is the approval of the bond anticipation notes. And all of these financings are sort of woven together. And to understand one, you really need the big picture of stepping back and looking at all of them and how they sort of relate to each other. So just in general, we've got the short-term debt, which is cash flow funding, both on the operation side, which is the tax anticipation note, as well on the capital side, which are the bond anticipation notes that are on the agenda today. And the bands, as we call them for short, really break down into two categories. There is the fixed cost of ownership, capital maintenance, funding that is eventually paid back through debt service millage, as well as cash flow funding for the sales tax program, which will never be paid from any debt service millage. At the end of the day, that's all paid out of the sales tax collections. Then moving on down, we've got long-term debt, which consists of general obligation bonds, which is the way that the district really funded all of their capital needs up until 2004, when there was a transition made to installment purchase revenue bonds, which are referred to as IPRBs or alternative financing, that funded the 2004 through 2009 capital programs through 3 series of bond issues. And then lastly is the sales tax program, which the district has just started on their 3rd sales tax program. The initial one was approved in 2010 and ran for 6 years. Then we had a new list of projects. That program was approved in 2014. And then most recently, the current program was approved in 2020. And that 1 cent started collections on January 1st of this year. And while that is all managed through debt, it's just on a short-term basis. And the whole shift of this, the intention, is to shift from debt that is paid back by property tax payers, but from the 1 penny that's spent by everybody coming into Charleston County to, come for the weekend or cruise ships or anything else. And so there really has been a big shift over the past 12 years for funding, not so much with general obligation debt, but with sales tax. The next slide. With short-term debt, as we were mentioning, tax anticipation note, and we will talk about this more in depth in probably August or September. But when you get your property tax bill, that usually comes in around October. And taxes are due without penalty by January 15th. And so most people pay their taxes in December and January. So the bulk of that money for operations comes in practically a 6-week period. And so by the time we get into the late summer or early fall, the bank account can be getting a little bit low on the operating side. And so this is just really borrowing in advance of the general fund tax collections. So we typically issue those notes around September or October, and they are required by state law to be paid back within 90 days of the due date for tax collections. So every year we have an April 1st maturity date. So that's just kind of basically getting an advance on our operating funds coming from property taxes. And then the second type of short-term financing are the bond anticipation notes. And we'll see when we look at what's being approved today, but there is a Series A issue every year, which pays the fixed cost of ownership, which is basically capital projects that are undertaken, a lot of them over the summer holidays, for re-roofing schools or painting or just typical kind of maintenance projects. There's also technology upgrades, as I said, kind of typical capital maintenance. And then the other part of that is to make payments on the installment purchase revenue bonds, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail. And then we always have a second series of bond anticipation notes, which is cash flow funding for the construction projects being funded by the sales tax program. And as we said, the current sales tax program started collections January 1 of this year. And so that will be sort of a bell curve over the course of the next 6 years. And so the construction gets ramped up before there are enough dollars in really to just use pay-as-you-go funding for that. And so with this bond anticipation note for sales tax, that is just to, it's like a construction loan, but it will be paid back. We will roll those notes every year for the 6-year period. And then at the expiration of the current sales tax period, those will be retired from sales tax collections. And Jay may touch on this a little bit more, but typically in the first kind of 3 years of a sales tax program, that first year you borrow a little bit that's for advanced design. Then the next year you need to retire that note and you're adding on to it for construction. And then the following year, you're probably going to be adding additional amounts. And then after the 4th year or so, it starts winding down as those collections have been rolling in and you're starting to finish up the earlier projects. But as I said, we're in the 3rd cycle now with that 3rd sales tax program. Next slide.
Carol, just 1 second. I think the slide's coming back up. Thank you.
Okay, we can go on to long-term debt, the next slide. Okay. And without going too much into the history of things, but up until really the mid 2000s, general obligation bonds were really school districts' only means for financing capital projects. And they were usually done over a 25-year period. There are 2 types of debt that are authorized. The state constitution says that any school district can issue up to 8% of its assessed value. And you're capped at that amount unless you hold a bond referendum, which then authorizes whatever amount of bonds you put into that referendum. And what was happening throughout the 1990s, Charleston was in a little bit better position because the tax base was so large, but so many of these very small school districts were just up against that debt limit and could not issue, didn't have capacity to issue any more debt. So that the only option then was to hold a bond referendum, and sometimes those were successful and sometimes they weren't. Charleston, I think the last bond referendum that was passed was about 1998. And then in the early 2000s, this concept of installment purchase revenue bonds or alternative financing was developed. And with those bonds, the school district does not issue the debt directly on its own. There is a 501c3, a nonprofit corporation, which in Charleston's case is called the Charleston Educational Excellence Financing Corporation, or CEF. You'll hear references from time to time about CEF. But the nonprofit issues the bonds, uses the money to build schools, and the school district makes semi-annual payments to CEF in amounts that are sufficient to make the principal and interest payments on the bonds. And in that way, the district is basically buying portions of those schools back from CEF on a semi-annual basis. And so with the outstanding IPRBs, they all have interest due on June 1st of each year, and then principal and interest is due on December 1st. So the district needs to have a means of raising money prior to June 1 and December 1 to make the payments on those bonds, which are in effect paying for the construction renovation of a number of schools that were financed in 2004, 5, and 6, including Buste, and just there's a long list, Academic Magnet, the list goes on throughout the district. So as I said, that is one of the things that we are here to talk about, is the financings for making those payments on the CEF bonds. And as I said, we did those financings in 2004, 5, and 6. And then in 2006, the state legislature said, no, we don't think you should be able to use this type of financing anymore. So from 2006, or from 2007 onwards, IPRBs were not available for financing school facilities, but we have had a couple of refundings, a couple of refinancings were done in 2013 and 2014 just to lower the interest rates. And that's another thing that we may be talking about sometime later on this year, is there may be the possibility later on in the year of, again, saving money by lowering the rates on those bonds. Then with the next slide, this just kind of puts together a timeline for the types of financings that we have been talking about. We'll skip long-term debt at the top and talk about the short-term debt that's listed here. April and May, we're actually coming to you now for the approval of the spring bond anticipation note, which will be issued in early May. And that is to fund all these different type projects we've been talking about, plus the sales tax. The spring ban, the Series A ban will be retired in November from a very short-term general obligation bond, which will be retired on March 1 of next year through millage issued in the 2023-24 budget. The sales tax ban will have a one-year maturity, and so in May of next year, we'll be coming back to refund that, possibly add new money, and that process will continue through 2028. The tax anticipation note, we mentioned, will be done in late summer, just whenever the need arises. And then the October and November annual general obligation bonds will be to retire the Series A ban and make the December 1 payment on the installment purchase bonds. And then finally, while we said that the district has not really issued any long-term debt in the past several years, there is the option there under the 8% debt limit, and that's something that various members of the finance team as well as PFM will be talking about, because there may be some schools later on this year, which I believe were approved as part of the current sales tax program, but there's been discussion about moving those forward by funding those through a general obligation bond, as opposed to waiting to see if there's enough money coming through on the sales tax program. Jay?
Thanks, Carol. And again, Jay Glover from PFM Financial Advisors. We are the district's financial advisor on debt-related matters. And while Carol gave kind of an overview of the words associated with these financings, I'm going to try to dig into the numbers just a little bit, but also keep it as high level as possible. We do maintain a fairly detailed Excel model that shows cash flows over the entire term of your debt portfolio, which is through fiscal year 2032, not only on the general obligation side, but also on the sales tax side. It looks at cash flows associated with the projects, sales tax collections, to make sure that the ultimate plan will be followed through on, which I think we've all talked about, which is the district being debt-free by 2032, which is still the plan and still on target, absent any future decisions that might be made to add debt service in the future. On slide 6 here, this is just pictorially what your current outstanding debt looks like that Carol just described. And it's broken down into the categories, just like she mentioned. On the top is your long-term GO bonds there, and you can see it's about $50 million outstanding as of March 1, 2023. And we also have a category that shows how much of that is approved within your 8% debt limit, because we always want to make sure there's sufficient capacity moving forward to issue 8% debt for the reasons Carol mentioned, which are to provide cash flow on your sales tax program, but also make sure there's capacity to pay your installment payments each twice a year. So again, 25 million of that long-term debt is 8% debt. The next category is your short-term bonds. And again, while this is a significant amount of debt, it's very short-term in nature for cash flow. And again, I won't go into the reasons why, as Carol just described, but 247, almost $250 million worth of your debt is short-term debt and associated with your 8% debt limit. Having said that, the 2022 B band, which is there about $74 million, that's the remaining piece of your phase 4 sales tax program. So your last collections just came in December for that program, and we'll actually pay all of the debt off in March of 2023, or excuse me, May of 2023. So you'll be completely debt-free on your phase 4 sales tax program. And the same thing with the 2022 C band. That's for your phase 5 program. Yeah, question?
I'm learning about this, obviously. So, but I know, like in my personal life, like with mortgages and things like that, if you're able to apply a little extra to your payment, then eventually you save money because you gain momentum faster on paying off debt. So 2 questions. Is that a possibility with any of this? And then also, if we become debt free, is that money that we can then apply to say, raising salaries for teachers?
Well, let me attack that in two different questions, and Mr. Kennedy might want to weigh in on the second piece there. But yes, most of this
No.
debt, yeah, that's the short answer. We can go into that. Most of this debt does have potential call flexibility. So there is the ability to pay it down early at points in time if there's additional cash to do that. Or if interest rates are lower, you can potentially refinance debt for debt service savings. So that is the flexibility, just like your mortgage, you can pay it down early potentially, but you obviously have to have the cash flow to do that. And within our current model, we target 28 mils for debt service, which really covers what you need to make existing payments. So to go above and beyond that, you'd likely have to raise an additional millage. As for the second question, we're really talking about debt service millage. So to the extent that goes to zero, I mean, you could potentially, raise an operating millage for salaries, but that's really unrelated to the debt service millage. That would give you a lot of flexibility in your capital program moving forward and allow you to reduce the millage levy on the citizens. And if you keep in mind with a debt service millage, that's not only residential, but that's also your commercial property. So that would be the benefit of that. Really lots of flexibility with the capital program and potentially a lower or no debt service millage. But Mr. Kennedy, I know that's probably a lot to handle there, but I don't know if you have anything you want to weigh in on.
I think that captured it. Yeah.
Again, it's very important to keep debt service separate from operating millage, but they do give you a little bit of flexibility.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I think I mentioned that homeowners, the debt service millage includes both your residential homeowners and your commercial properties, whereas your operating millage is really just your commercial base.
We like that.
And just going through the 2022 C band. So that was actually $81 million. That was your initial upfront money for your phase 5 sales tax program. So as was mentioned, your collections didn't start till January of 2023, but there's a lot of advanced design and planning that comes about so these projects can be put into the ground. So last year, we actually raised $81 million so we could start paying for some of that advanced design so that we can get those projects started very quickly. So again, that's $81 million. We will be rolling that as part of the 2023 B band and adding about 40 million additional to that. So you'll have about $120 million of cash flow band associated with your phase 5 program. And as was mentioned, that will ramp up over time and then probably level out. And we'll start paying that band down as we approach the sunset of the phase 5 program, just like we're doing in May of this year with the phase 4 program. And then the 2022 A and B, those were the GO bonds that Carol mentioned that are issued in the November timeframe and paid off in March of 2023 with that debt service millage that we talked about. Again, very short-term debt that will be coming back to you in late fall to be talking about. And then the last pieces of debt were, again, the installment purchase revenue bonds that were previously done. And those are what they are, and we pay those down annually. And again, if you look at the maturity date of each of those columns, the latest one is December 1 of 2031, your fiscal year 2032. So we're right on target using very conservative assumptions to pay this off and meet that program. I know that was a question that came up before, but we're very conservative on our estimates in terms of assessed value growth. I think we use between 1.5% and 2% annually, and we do not assume a reassessment, which happens every 5 years. So we think we're very conservative on that. Also with the sales tax program, the baseline that we are using for your sales tax collections now, if there was 0% growth over the entire term of this program, we would still have sufficient funds to actually pay that debt off. Again, as we move through the program, we reassess the collections, the timing of projects, and are adding projects as we can, but we don't want to do that too quickly because we're really only in the second month of collections. And while things have been great the last several years, we're always cautious of a recession or, if inflation becomes much more in check and the cost of items goes down, that also negatively impacts your sales tax collection. So if there's one of a few takeaways from this is that we're very conservative in our assumptions because we don't want to put you in a situation where you don't have sufficient capacity to pay your debt off. And I'm going to move here pretty quickly. Again, page 7, if we can flip one more slide. This is a calculation of your 8% debt. So it takes your assessed valuations, takes 8% of that. And the good thing for Charleston County School District is you have $413 million worth of 8% capacity, which generally grows as your assessed values grow. Again, you're in a very fortunate position in this terms. There's many districts that are nice, quite nice size that might only have 40 or 50 million of 8% capacity. And you can imagine what 40 or 50 million dollars worth of debt does in terms of building schools. It doesn't get you very far. So you are in a very good position, and we stay well within that limit within all of our projections in our model. Flipping to the next slide, and again, I'm trying not to get too much in the weeds, but this is really the output that we look at moving forward. It shows what not only your current obligations are, but what your future obligations are, because we're very cognizant of you have current debt, but you also have debt that has to be issued through that 2032 timeframe to make sure we pay off those installment purchase revenue bonds. So when you take into account all of your current debt, what we need to pay off your installment revenue bonds, and what we currently have in terms of your phase 5 sales tax program, the full $120 million after the issuance of this ban, you still have $172 million worth of 8% debt capacity. And while that is important, there's a plan in place to actually issue about $99 million worth of that capacity later this year for some projects that are scheduled to be done. So even if that is approved and we move forward with that, there's still sufficient capacity within your 8% debt limit to handle all of this. And then skipping to page 9, I think this goes without saying, or we've actually said it a bunch already. This 8% capacity changes over time. Hopefully assessed values continue to grow, which improves that 8% capacity, also improves the amount of money that you can generate by that 28 mils of debt service levy. It also improves as debt is retired, but then if we issue new debt, it goes down. So it's a real balancing act that we model out over again the full term of your program to make sure we stay well within the limits. And we've mentioned this before as well. We target $28 million, 28 mils for debt service. We issue about $55 million a year for fixed cost of ownership. I think the slides went back one more. You're fine. And that grows each year as the needs grow. So going to the last slide, and again, I think this is another one of the takeaways, and we'll kind of come full circle from Ms. Williams' presentation. It seems like there's a lot of debt outstanding, and there is a lot of debt. It's big numbers. You're a very large school district, but the district staff and the board has been very proactive in how they manage this debt, and it's really resulted in very strong credit ratings. So if you look here, we pay off about $45 million of debt per year, and all the debt will be paid off by fiscal year 2032. We continue to reiterate that because that's something we've talked about for years and years and are on plan to do that. We also have been in a declining interest rate cycle up until about a year ago. So we've been very proactive in taking advantage of market conditions to do refinancings. You talk about your mortgage, just like you would refinance your mortgage as rates go down. We've done that with the district's debt and saved to the tune of about $90 million on a net present value basis since 2010. Those opportunities might be less frequent moving forward because we're on a rising interest rate environment now. And we've actually lowered the debt rate on each of our outstanding obligations significantly. There's one main opportunity we are monitoring associated with your installment purchase revenue bonds that with a little bit of help from interest rates over the next year or so, we might be able to save some money on that, but that would come back to you for further consideration at the appropriate time. And I'll conclude just by saying, anytime you issue debt, you go out and get what's called a credit rating. So that's a third party entity that comes in and looks at the financial position of the district, your debt metrics, and they put a credit rating on the district. And right now you're rated AA2 and AA+ by Moody's and S&P. AAA is the highest credit rating you can get, which is one notch below that AA+ rating that you have. And I am not aware of any school district, at least in the state of South Carolina and potentially in the nation. I'm sure there might be one in the nation. I probably shouldn't say it on the record, but not in South Carolina that I'm aware of that has a AAA rating. There's just issues with school districts where the rating agencies very rarely get to a AAA rating. But They do cite things in the report like strong financial position, strong wealth levels, steady population, enrollment growth, manageable leverage. And then they also highlight the obvious: you're a coastal community, they're susceptible to climate risk. And one of the biggest things associated with this credit rating is, if you'll remember Ms. Williams' presentation, in 2016, that $12.2 million fund balance, the ratings were not this at that point in time. And there was a period of time where the ratings were going the wrong direction. I think they got as low as potentially A, at least in the A category, mainly related to that fund balance. And since then, that steady progression in fund balance up to the $159 million level last year is really one of the main reasons why these credit ratings are so strong. So I would encourage you to continue to be vigilant about fund balance and make sure that's sort of at the top of your mind when you're making financial decisions, which I know it will be. But again, if there's just a couple of takeaways, I know it sounds like a lot of debt, but it is very conservatively managed. Your staff is very proactive about how they go about doing it. We as financial professionals support them in doing so. And I think we'll be in good position to execute on that plan to have you all out of debt by 2032, absent any decisions you might make in the future to add additional debt. But with that, I know it was a lot and a little bit in the weeds, but I hope that at least gives you a sense of things that might come before you in terms of debt, and reassure you that it is managed in a proactive and efficient manner.
Just to go back to what you were saying about the rating, is this saying that we are over AA on our way to AAA? Well,
So you're one notch below a AAA rating, which is the highest credit rating you can have. And actually S&P doesn't rate the federal government AAA. So I think like Charleston County is a AAA, and it's not uncommon for a city or county to get to that AAA level, which is the highest level. I would suggest to you that staying at that AA plus level is a great achievement. And absent any financial deterioration, you would stay there. It's very unlikely the school district is going to get to that AAA rating. And the reason is because you would have to build your fund balance up to a level that's probably not seen very well by the state per se. They would want you to spend that money. So you get to some point where, your fund balance needs to get so high to get to AAA that you really don't want to get there, because there's trade-offs in terms of your operations and other things to do that, if that makes sense. But getting to that AA plus level where you are is a great accomplishment and puts you probably at the top of where school districts are rated in the state of South Carolina.
We like that.
Thank you, Jay. One thing I wanted to add to Jay's great presentation is one thing I wanted to highlight that he said is that we do this work in partnership with PFM. So the finance team is very diligent about discussing what our debt is, the financial outlook. I know I specifically and the CFOs before me have asked for different scenarios to model out things before we bring them to the board. And they're very good at doing that. So we take all things into consideration before we bring something as significant as debt before the board for voting.
And Ms. Williams, if I might add, I know there was a lot of questions. We prepare a presentation periodically that goes to your sales tax oversight committee that looks at stress test. And we look at what the baseline revenue is. We look at like what happens if there's a 15% decline recession scenario, and then you grow at 2% after that. And really under almost every scenario, you're well within the baselines in the model. And we hope that over time, the collections are much stronger than we're estimating, but we intentionally are very conservative in that. And that served you well. You've hit COVID. It was a temporary blip, thankfully, but you all rebounded relatively well. And we hope that any future kind of issues we'll be able to withstand as well.
So Carol is going to review one final component of debt, just so you guys are ultra clear on what we're presenting to you for a vote. Maggie, can you pull that up, please?
Yes, that's it. As I mentioned when we got started, that we do have one item on the agenda today that makes this presentation timely, because we are talking about the bond anticipation notes, which we will go out in the market to sell in April and then close on those in May. And one requirement of that, or anytime we issue debt, the board has to approve a resolution authorizing the issuance of the debt. And so we've got the sort of 40-page document here that has all of the details. And then what Maggie has up on the screen is the sort of the two-page Cliff Notes edition. And so we can just kind of walk through that quickly just to spell out the specifics of what's being approved. We've got 3 series that we are looking to have approved in this resolution, and this all relates back to what we were talking about with the bond anticipation notes. We've got Series A, which is being authorized in the amount not to exceed $70 million. And that will fund 3 different parts of the overall program. As I mentioned earlier, we will use funding from that to make the installment payments, the June 1 interest payment on the installment bonds. And the total funding that will be coming from Series A band will be approximately $5.9 million. And then the second and the largest piece of it is the fixed cost of ownership program, which will include facilities maintenance, technology, security, furnishings, and equipment. And I believe there's an item on the agenda today that will go into some detail as to exactly what is being approved to be funded in that fixed cost of ownership sort of umbrella. And there, the approximate amount is $55 million. And then finally, there were 3 schools that were approved in the current sales tax program. And we issued a small amount of money last year, I think, to fund the advanced design of these schools, being Morningside Middle School, AC Corcoran Elementary, and Deer Park Middle. And the Series 2023 A band will include approximately $1.2 million to begin construction on those schools. So that's Series A. And Series A will be paid off in November of this year by a short-term general obligation bond, which will be retired in its entirety on March 1st of 2024. And so where we are talking about issuing debt to retire debt, it still will all be within about a 9-month period. And then Series B is the sales tax program. We're asking for authorization of not to exceed $135 million. And those funds will be used for 2 purposes. It will retire the 2022 sales tax ban, which matures in May this year, in the approximate amount of $84.5 million. And then it will also provide cash flow funding for construction of approximately $40 million of the current sales tax program. And then finally, one smaller item that we really didn't touch on, but back in 2020, there was a refunding opportunity to refunding a portion of the 2013 installment bonds. But because of changes in the tax law since those bonds were issued, the 2020 refunding bonds could not be issued as tax exempt, but they could be issued as taxable and still generated, sufficient savings. So we've got a very small issue here that's not exceeding $2 million will be issued as a short-term taxable bond to make the June 1 interest payment on the taxable IPRBs. So if you flip over to the next slide, that gives a very general listing of the fixed cost of ownership projects there. And then at the end is a recap of the different portions of these 3 bond anticipation notes and what specifically they are funding in the approximate amounts. So as I said, this will be on the agenda for the regular meeting for approval. And we just thought, since we were sort of in the mindset of talking about all these debt issues, to go through this item now, just in case there were any questions related to it.
Well, if there are no questions, this concludes the board budget workshop. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
First, I'm gonna have to have a refresher.